What I hope you gain from my presentation today is that understanding as much as possible about the complex social ecosystem of public participation in digital Earth will help us make a better digital Earth. I'm Dr. Patricia Solís, Executive Director of the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience at Arizona State University and an Associate Research Professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. I'm also the Director and co-founder of Youth Mappers, which is one example of public participation in digital Earth that I will use as an illustration today. Youth Mappers are part of the OpenStreetMap ecosystem. OpenStreetMap is an excellent example to use to interrogate what we mean by trying to understand this complex social ecosystem of a digital Earth as a massive geospatial digital project. And one of the main examples that we explore in our chapter that we co-authored together in our book here, chapter 18 in the Manual of Digital Earth. This is dedicated to the possibilities for active contribution that digital Earth offers people who can use and make it, with a special focus on the relationships between digital Earth and public participation in scientific research, which is also known as citizen science. Citizen science can be thought of as a tremendous catalyst for making digital Earth a participation model of our world so that it actually represents what we want to depict. Moreover, who is that we really does matter. Our chapter presents a wide overview of the concept and practice of citizen science in terms of the technologies and social ecosystems centered on this OSM example. So today I will just present a part of this chapter's exploration into this idea on what the social ecosystem itself could look like. Created in 2004, OSM has been very successful, somewhat along the lines of Wikipedia. Approximately 5 million volunteers have contributed to this project in that time, and it really has become the largest existing geospatial database that is made by people and for people, in contrapart to official data sets or the largely private data sets like Google products. So there's many ways which these different sources and the platforms interact with each other, of course. So this is part of that ecosystem, but I'm going to focus and zero in on this social ecosystem of building and this technology of the open digital Earth created by and for people. So let's take a minute to look at that, really. This concept of so-called citizen science is important to tear apart for a moment, because it can sometimes be contested in this term of citizen that kind of evokes a normative role of what might it mean to belong to and act as a member of a particular social group, usually a nation, but also any other kinds of groups, and the implications for what it means to be a particular resident of a location that might be being mapped. So in this chapter, we are asserting that these perspectives are not just rhetorical. They're not just labels in the matter of practical terms, but they really have meaning on who is doing the contributions, whether those actors are refugees or resident immigrants participating in that contribution. However, it's the important part to remember, rather than just the terminology of citizen science, is that these are all peopled processes that literally take place somewhere. And there are a lot of scholars who have previously sort of given us some frameworks to think about. And I'm going to just share with you a couple of them that we have elaborated in the chapter. One of them is this by Shirk and others, who classifies this kind of public participation according to the different types of projects and the different models of the projects, whether they're contributory, just data collection, or whether they're more collaborative, that also involve some kind of collaboration around the project design, or whether they go more intensely to co-created or even collegial type of projects, which are developed together and also recognized with each other. But those are basic ways that we can look at how we can task a framework for understanding citizen science. Another good one is this one by Harkele and others, who distinguish these projects in at least 3 different classes. As you can see here, long-running citizen science, or citizen cyber science, or community science. These are different kinds of modalities, and these can be further subclassified to the extent of whether they're very passive or very active or DIY, do-it-yourself kinds of science projects. So these are another kind of ways of observing how we create data and information about the Earth, especially geospatial data. But it's important to clarify just a couple more terms in this space as well. So in addition to citizen science, we use the term crowdsourcing very often, or geo-crowdsourcing, which really was coined in 2005 to describe the outsourcing and spreading, viral spreading generally through an open call of that task, the part of the job that was previously made by one of the collaborators in a project to the crowd. And they may or may not be aware of whether they are contributing to this. Contrast that with volunteer geographic information, which really highlights the active contribution of people when they're providing data, either about themselves or about other kinds of subjects. VGI, for short, was proposed in 2005 as an alternative kind of definition, and that includes examples such as OpenStreetMap. So let's move back to our chapter now to really explore in depth these rationales before we get to our example, where we can look at how this interfaces with Digital Earth in particular. So in terms of OpenStreetMap, which is actually one of the most well-known and researched examples of a VGI project, where data is actively, knowingly crowdsourced at a global scale. Many people do consider OpenStreetMap to be the object or the map itself, right? Or the platform itself. But many others also consider it a community because this includes that sort of social ecosystem. And if you want to be really accurate about it, I regularly contend, and as I justify in this chapter, OpenStreetMap really should be thought of as a community of communities, of different groups of people, which might have shifting kinds of alliances that are not mutually exclusive, that incorporates the different motivations and the different kinds of groups that approach OpenStreetMap and the collection and creation of that kind of a data. So together with the technology products and the systems, the platform, as well as the people, this is what we think of when we're talking about that social network. So present to you this proposal that we think about the dimensions of characterizing the citizen participation in Digital Earth, specifically through the example of OpenStreetMap, as a community of communities, where you can think about it in these fluid categories that are not mutually exclusive. They can be sector-based categories through the types and ways of engaging and contributing, and also their type of social-based categories, which really goes into who is doing the mapping, okay? So let's look at this first part. Sector-based categories, obviously these are pretty traditional. The nonprofit civil society sector, here's where you encounter a lot of actors from the humanitarian sector. So the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, for example, Red Cross, Red Crescent. And those could also be local or nonprofit entities. In addition to that, we have the education sector, the academic sector, who are using OpenStreetMap to learn or maybe to navigate, and those could be everything from K-12 teachers like Teach OSM to university students and faculty like we work with the Youth Mappers network. There's also a lot of government public sector actors, which include everything from local municipalities, for example, how the World Bank, Open Cities uses OpenStreetMap in a constellation of actors, all the way to national agencies and multinational organizations. And again, these are not all mutually exclusive. You can also think about how the private industry and the for-profit or the commercial sector intersects with OpenStreetMap. Any number of entities like Mapbox, Maxar, TomTom, all of these different industry-based organizations that are acting in very unique ways, sector-based kind of constellations of who is doing the mapping. And these are important to consider, as well as how they are doing this, right? So I've proposed here at least three different kinds of modalities, which have to do with whether they are contributing data, like you have the data contributors, those who are maybe creating local data or remote data or uploading data sets. And then there are the providers of map-based services around the OpenStreetMap resources. This is where there's being value added in some way, right? So any number of the third-party services or sort of functional providers like navigation, 3D rendering, any kind of additional overlay services, OSM names, open fire map, those kinds of entities, as well as the thematic providers, right? These are groups of people who will come around to adding value around a particular attribute like biking, for example, or sports or art, whatever that they decide is a thematic value added. And finally, the categories of consumers, of course, we have any number of entities and groups of people that use OpenStreetMap as a base map, like Wikipedia, weather.com, Snapchat, or as internal systems like Uber does, for example. So this can also include the very same data contributors like students who use the very data that they create for their own research and theses. And finally, in this category of the social-based sectors, or categorizations of how people come to OpenStreetMap, we can think of how citizen science and contributes to digital Earth in the kinds of ways that the people relate to each other within that engagement, right? So it could be a very purpose-driven way that people come together to the map, like the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team coming together around humanitarian purposes, project-based action. There can also be sort of identity-focused ways that people connect to each other. GeoChicas is a really great example of how women are supporting each other to work into the map more female participation and also projects that use them for women's purposes. And then finally, place-based kinds of collections of people, such as the Tanzania Development Trust does in Tanzania, something that really generates those social connections with the users in that group in a reference to a particular location. But again, these all describe every kinds of that interaction, and I want to give you a sort of an example and illustration in real life in motion. And this is with Youth Mappers. As you can see, Youth Mappers is a global consortium of students. So there's some identity-based connections there who are working on campuses. So there's some discrete local identity who are creating and using open maps. So there's some of the modalities for humanitarian development purposes, right? So this is crossing over from the academic sector as well as some of the actions in nonprofit and the government. So you can describe this group with many of those different characteristics, and each one of them is sort of a constellation of those different characteristics. In all, Youth Mappers actually to date now has 345 university campuses in 72 countries where there have been students acting in this way and coming together in these kinds of social ecosystems. Youth Mappers actually do map from both remotely in sort of an explicit way and locally with more implicit kinds of mappings, whether those are features and or attributes in many different ways that they add value to the map, mapping with their own local communities, and also mapping with each other, sometimes remotely and sometimes together. In general, you can track the kinds of actions to the map that Youth Mappers have been responsible for creating through this tool, activity.youthmappers.org, and you'll see many different contributions all around the world and where those are coming from and who's doing them as well. We like to say that we don't just build maps, we build mappers. A really great example of this is our recent book that was just released, where students are both actively creating and using data to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And you'll see here a book of written by 60 different co-authors from 25 different countries on open mapping toward the SDGs using OpenStreetMap and the voices of Youth Mappers on their own community engaged scholarship. So I want to dispel a few of the myths around this kind of a social entity by showing you a little bit about Youth Mappers and some of the data that we've collected on them. There's a myth that participating youth only map remotely, right? But we can see by tracking the editing of all of these thousands of students that there are some students, maybe a third of them, that actually only map remotely. There are also some that only map locally. And then there's a very large portion in between, you can see this curve, that actually do some proportion of both. Another myth around this kind of community is that everyone in a community maps in the same way, right? So we want to make sure that as we're building these frameworks to understand how citizens are coming to digital Earth, that we don't conflate that everyone, even within a particular community, is doing all the same things. You can see in our own community youth mappers, there is a tendency to have a pretty good mix, but the output of the mappers by each of these tendencies is very different. You can see the vast majority, about 97% of all data that is contributed is really contributed by people who do both remote and local mapping. Another myth that you might think of that we need to dispel when we're looking at social ecosystems is how participants in a community might map the same features, right? They're not all mapping the same things. They're not mapping in the same ways. And we've done some analysis of this by gender by our students. So you can see that buildings, highways, and different amenities are mapped by different genders in our community in different ways, right? One of the other things that is a myth is that student mapping is not of high quality, or maybe it's not good for anything that it goes beyond the classroom. And in fact, we've done a lot of work in this area to see how volunteered mapping and data governance can actually be put to use for official cartographies. And we have a really great example that was recently released with the Pan American Institute for Geography and History for the some countries in the Americas in particular, on what are some of the opportunities as well as the barriers that still exist for how volunteered mapping, that citizen science, can really be put to use with those official cartographies in other sectors. Another myth is that students are a fleeting community because, you know, they come and they go, they graduate. But a recent study here, printed in the Association for Computing Machinery, indicates that the engagement of students are actually quite strong, and the retention rates are actually quite strong. So this also means that the longer that they stay, the better the quality is, and we have long-term mappers even if they are only students for short term. And finally, there is a myth that it doesn't really matter why people map as long as they're mapping and they're contributing. But we've also researched this in terms of looking at the impact of what kinds of contextual information you provide to students on how they perform and what is their interest to continue to learn about digital Earth and contributing to geospatial open mapping. It really does make a difference. Knowing why you are creating data on a map really helps students understand the digital transformation better. It sort of reduces the technological load of learning something new. And it also, we've seen early results that perhaps it can plant seeds of empathy for students for learning about other times, other places, other communities. So here's some final takeaways with this sort of an exploration about citizen science for building a digital Earth. I really want to emphasize that we do need a lot more study on these sort of cultural and organizational aspects of the spatial data production, not only in OpenStreetMap as one instance of a citizen science created digital Earth product, but specifically digital Earth as a whole. There's a lot of different ways that we could understand these various cultural and organizational aspects so that we can keep improving the contributions and the products. Although it's important to see these kinds of entities, OpenStreetMap in particular, and youth mappers as a community within that community of OpenStreetMap. That helps us recognize the diversity and the complexity of these social ecosystems and really take seriously the people-centered nature of digital Earth. Citizen science more broadly does generate a public good, and in many ways it enables us to have something as valuable as digital Earth represents to us, but we also have to invest in those kinds of communities as an integral part of that process of building a digital Earth. So in conclusion, I really want you to take away that understanding as much as possible about that complex social ecosystem of public participation in digital Earth helps us make a better digital Earth. Life is a team sport, and so is open mapping, so let's do it together.